for new writers,
Mm,
um, the character arc is probably the one they think the least about.
I
And the
agree.
reason I say that is because often when they think of a hero in a story that's usually slightly based on them,
Right.
which is totally fine, they create this like perfect individual, this perfect representation of, this hero of their own story, the most interesting, like, oh, I'd totally be friends with this person. They like all the same things, whatever. But if you make them so good at the beginning, like there's never any, it's a flat character arc. There's no improvement. Hello, writers and crafters. I'm Valerie Isan.
And I'm Eric Mertz.
And this is episode 185 of the podcast. It's April 30th, 2025, as we record this. Today, we're talking about the three arcs in every book. First, we want to thank
Mm.
our existing patrons for believing in our work offline and also here on the podcast. You can become a patron of the arts at patreon.com/Valerie Isan and patreon.com/Strange Air Stories. We both have awesome stuff over there. So go check it out. Author update. I have started writing in my How to Write a Novel book. So I'm working on nonfiction for writers right now. And I plugged in. Remember last week I told you I wrote the new intro, which became actually the first chapter of the book instead. Because I don't know, like who reads intros? Just I do
I
sometimes,
do.
but
I do. I do. Always.
so yeah, and so I started kind of revising and it's fun to go back and reread stuff that you've haven't looked at for I mean this was a trunk book. Like I wrote this before the pandemic. Well before, well, not well before, but pretty before the pandemic. Like 2018 maybe I wrote it. 2019 at the latest. So it's been in the trunk for a long time. And I pulled it out. I'm like, damn, this is good stuff. I really like this. So there's just more stuff that I need to add in to make it a little bit more my voice. I think that was the feedback I got from the alpha readers before was, this doesn't really sound like the feedback I got was this sounds like a book report. That there's just not enough of your own examples in here. You're just referring to other examples which is normal, when you're teaching and such. But anyway, I definitely want to ask ChatGPT, like, what about this title though, right? I mean, we all come from this SEO not background, but like it's it's on our mind a lot and how to create the the title that people would be looking for. And Joe Penn was always like, yeah, how to write a novel. Like, that's what you type into the search engine box. So if you want your book to show up, then that's what you write, even if it's not a sexy title. I think there's probably a lot of how to write a novel books out there as the title. So I need something, I don't know. I definitely want something a little jazzier, but maybe how to write a novel can be the subtitle. Maybe I can come up with something a little bit more interesting and then, yeah, I don't know.
Yeah,
You're
the
the
best of
SEO
those.
guy. What do you think?
Well, you got to give me like a little time to go digging in because the analytics sometimes like blow your mind. Like, oh wow, that's a better title than that. I would have never thought. It's
That's
just
true. I could
there.
use Publisher Rocket and find out. Maybe that would be a
I
good
would
idea.
I would use Publisher Rocket, but I was just gonna say from a person that like, do I know how to write a novel? I don't know. I don't know if I know how to write a novel, but I know I don't not know how to write a novel. See how I did
Are
that
you
there?
shooting down my idea or are you
No, I'm just
saying
saying, no. I'm not shooting down any ideas. That's not what I do. I was going to say the best of those books always sneak up on me. I always read them for like, you know, I'm going to give myself some new information. I'm going to refresh what I believe I know about the craft. But the best of those books always feel like, oh, wow, like that whole lesson snuck up on me. So I think
mm-hmm,
that like, it's and that comes in that voice. That comes in that like, this
mm-hmm.
is I love Larry Brooks, He's a Willamette writer veteran, and I don't know
Story
if he's still
engineering.
story engineering. Yeah, great stories don't write themselves. I read that book, and I actually got to the end of it and had to do the whole like rewind, like, oh yeah, wow, I learned a whole lot from this book. It wasn't just a refresher. So there's an art to that.
That
There's a
doesn't
little
tell
art
me
to
about the title. What do I name that?
that. I don't.
I'll have
We'll have a to be continued. Yeah,
Yeah, I'll have to check.
I'll do
I'll
some
have to
SEO.
check the publisher rocket and ask ChatGPT. I've also been doing a lot of homework for this business coaching program I'm in and thinking about content creation and refining my book coaching offer. I also, because I had a bunch of, well, I'm going to use the excuse that I had a bunch of deadlines before and I wasn't working out. So it took me 3, maybe 4 weeks in between like workouts. And I went back the first time, I think Saturday. So not even a whole week ago. And I worked out Saturday and I worked out Monday night. Sunday, excuse me, Sunday, I and I'm always the second day after working out is the most painful. I
Yeah,
don't know. Everyone says it's the day after, but it's really the day after that that hurts the worst for me. So if I worked out Saturday morning, by Monday morning, I don't know. Anyways, I lost track of time, but somewhere in there, I tweaked something in my lats and now I have a lot of pain and I can't like it's on the cusp of spasm all the time. I'm like
I
super
hate that
careful
feeling.
and it feels kind of weird. Like maybe it's not cartilage, but like the connective tissue that's inflamed.
Hmm.
Can that happen? I
Fascia.
don't know. The fascia, yeah. Like
Is your fascia
can your fascia
inflamed?
inflame? I don't know. It's been a while since I've
Yeah,
been an
yeah,
LMT, so I can't remember, but
yeah. I mean,
I
my
think
wife does a
that's
lot
what's
of fascia
happening.
work. She's very fascia oriented.
Yeah, so I think that's kind of what's happening. And also, I'm seeing a chiropractor for the first time in like a year tomorrow. So I'm super happy about that. I finally found one, and hopefully he'll be good. It's hard to find a chiropractor when you had the same one for like 10 years.
Yeah, I could see that being a problem.
So that's my author update. What about you?
It's funny you mentioned trunk books. I have this new summer with a kid mantra where I say, you need to get, summer is 12 weeks long, you need to get 9 weeks of work done. I mean, and then that's not like for vacation necessarily, but it's just the disruption, the change in schedules, the like,
Hmm.
everything gets kind of up thrown out. But what I really found myself wanting to do is this. I have so many trunk books. I have so many trunk stories. I have so much trunk material
You're just
that
a trunky dude.
I probably have, like, I'm not kidding. I've probably got 4 books in one series. I have so much stuff. So I've really, really focused on how do I feel like new? Because I love the new thing, just like everybody else. Like, we love the new. But also at the same time, um, start getting that stuff out there. Like, why do I have 13, 14 stories sitting around? Why shouldn't I have that in a collection of stories? Like, it just becomes this like, okay, how do I? So I've been giving myself the project of let's find the old things and figure out a way to both resurrect it and feel like I'm creating something new. So it's like that's kind of the mission.
Sometimes those trunk stories and trunk books end up in the trunk on purpose. Like they just
They
don't
do.
have legs, like, oh, this is a cool idea. 10,000 words in. No, never mind. And you're never
Yeah,
going to
and
resurrect it because it just wasn't a good idea, but they're still there. Every once in a while, the
yeah,
characters are like, hey, what about me?
yeah, yeah, yeah. I have like this pile of Patreon stories that, you know, like I need a better print version of witness stories. I've got 2 or 3 books in the Strange Air series that I've written the first and second draft of. It's just time to put that stuff out. It's all stuff that I liked. It's just I was following shiny. Um,
Hmm.
so now it's just time to get those things focused and moving.
So you're going to pick the trunk stories that you're going to work on in the summer.
Yeah, well, like for example, I have like a bunch of those the stories that I was publishing on Patreon initially. They're just sitting on Patreon, so I'm now going to take those and collect those into a book with the other witness accounts that I had written years
Mm.
ago to
Hmm.
a bigger print version of those. Um, and so I said to myself, well, what fun is it going to be collecting all these old stories? I just figured out here's four more of those stories that I could write that were in the notebook that I really liked. I'm just gonna, this is how I'm gonna make it feel new. I'm gonna write four new ones. Um,
Nice.
so that's what I'm talking about. Just like, finding an old project and how to make it new. I've got stories in my main series that are like, I've got whole novels. I've got like three novellas that are just, they're really, I think they're really good, but the
I
now
loved that
the
first one that you had, the first book I edited for you, I think it was. And you
well, that's
never
a good
took it
one.
anywhere. I loved that book.
It doesn't fit in the series. So like it doesn't fit in the sequence. So now it's that kind of thing. Like how do I
Hmm.
take this thing, it really works, and make it fit? And now some people might hear that and say, it feels like recycling, or it feels like it's the story fits the world in my head, and it fits the world somewhere. So I think one of the things that's got to happen is like I really need to um I'm gonna book myself like a long weekend, maybe a week of just sort of like retreat world building. Like sit down and like with all of this stuff in mind and sit by a river somewhere and say, all right, let's flesh the world out to the point, the optimal size and dimension, and you know, get as much of the stuff involved as possible. So to be
That's,
continued.
yeah, that's, I think, a fantastic idea. What are you reading?
You know, it's funny you say that. I'm actually reading
We say that every
Mr.
week, Eric.
I do. It's like my standard line. There's our t-shirt. Like it's funny you say that. Um I picked up Mr. Mercedes by uh Stephen King. It's part of a three-book series. I know that that freaks you out. Um but I've wanted to read this three-book series. So Mr. Mercedes is on my shelf. I'm reading it now. I'm also reading a graphic novel by Becky Cloonan called Somna, which was an award winner. Um, but the reason I say it was funny, the reason I went there is I picked up this book at the library, Alter Ego. Um, Perfectly fine book, but I read like two chapters of it and I was like, you do not jump the stack, my friend. You are a perfectly fine book, but you're not a stack jumper. And I just put it in the return pile. I have a pile of stuff to return to the library. It went right in there.
Good for
My
you. I
son,
don't
my son,
often have the guts to do that, but
my
there's
son
just
was
so
like, "You
much to
didn't like
read.
that book?" My son says, "You didn't like that book?" I said, "No, the book was fine. It's just it's not good enough to get ahead of that one right there." So, you can be a perfectly fine marathon runner. You're just not going to win. That's the message I have for Alter Ego by Alex Segura. Perfectly fine book. Just wasn't going to jump the stack.
I am still
What about you?
reading The Stars and Their Light by Olivia Hawker and enjoying it. I have purchased several books since then that I'm like, really wanting to get into. So hopefully I can finish this soon. I also have been finding that I'm not reading quite as much as I used to. And I think that part of that has been um, because my husband also is doing some hard, like deadline work. And his deadline is the day before we go to Florida. So if he misses his deadline at all, it's going to like creep into our vacation. So he's trying really hard, staying up, doing all these long nights and stuff. So we don't spend as much time together right now because he's working. And so when I go sit in the hot tub, which is when I read, he joins me so that, we can have some, like quality time together before he goes off and works for a couple more hours. So my
Mm.
reading time I have discovered has been curtailed just a little bit temporarily. So I'm going
Mm.
through this book a little bit slower than I normally read novels. So, but it's really interesting and I'm really getting into it. I'm about halfway through.
Mm. All right.
That is mine. Any tidbits or anything you want to share before we get into the meat?
No, nothing.
Yeah, me either. I don't have anything new that I want to share really resource wise. So, all right, let's get talking about the three arcs. So, I first heard about the three arcs of a story from William Kennewer from Seattle. And he had come down to Eugene to talk with the Eugene chapter of the Willamette Writers organization that I was helping to host, to run at that time. And I never forgot this three arcs. You can Google it if you just type in three arcs of the story. Is that how you Googled it, Eric?
Well, I know Bill Kennewer's website, so I Googled. Oh, I knew his name, so when I entered it, it went right to. It's on his website. It's just a PDF you can download.
That's awesome. But what has he titled it? The
The
download?
three narrative arcs.
The three narrative arcs. Okay. So yeah, I every time I think about story structure now, that's sort of in the back of my head. And I teach part of it. I don't want to steal it. And I always mention his name when I bring it up. But the
That's
three,
that's that's the right thing to do.
yeah, the three narrative arcs then, one is the narrative arc, and then one is the story arc, and then one is the character arc.
Yeah, he calls the narrative arc sort of the physical arc. The
The
boy meets
physical arc.
girl,
Okay.
boy loses girl, boy wins girl back. That's the physical arc of a story.
Okay. And that's what I was calling the story arc. Okay.
Yeah.
Like the plot, like the stuff that happens in the story from,
You can just say that because I think for most people, that's the concept of what plot is. It's the stuff that happens.
yeah.
Yeah, boy
And
meets
then
girl,
the
girl loses
narrative
girl.
arc is like the invisible dude that's telling the story. Like how the story is being told from beginning to end. Is it in flashbacks? Is it going from this to this? Is it chronological? Like it's the way the story is being told. The stuff that's happening is being told in this way, in this manner. And then the character arc is the emotional arc. I've heard that interchanged also as well. So that's the one that I get most excited about. And when I teach, that's usually the one that I'm most focused on because it fits with all of the other things that I do and teach. And that's how I start any book project really is with character. When
Yeah.
I get an idea, it's usually a person that comes, to mind. And
Right.
I kind of not research, but like I I chat with the character in some form and find out like who is this person? What are their problems? What flaws do they have? What do they want? And then I kind of like create the character arc first through the plotting, through the outlining of the book, and then I can start writing. What about
I
you?
think that, well, I just to sort of, just from the teaching standpoint, um, I don't teach necessarily what this stuff is, but I do, when I do developmentally edit with people, like the stuff that happens is I don't want to say it's the easy part because there's still a massive challenge to make the stuff that happens interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Um, you don't just conjure up interesting sci-fi or fantasy out of just that's not easy. However, the why is and the how are tend to be the harder part. It's like, yes, boy meets girl, boy loses girl, boy gets girl back. And I have to also say, why is it boy meets girl? Why can't it be girl meets boy?
Yeah.
Girl loses boy, girl gets boy back. Why can't it be
Or we can just
boy,
ungender the whole thing,
they meet they? Um,
right?
I wasn't being sarcastic. Like you could
No.
just a person meets a person,
Yeah.
person loses person, person gets person. Why can't it be boy meets girl, girl loses boy, boy gets girl back? Why does it always like one the why is it always, one person is the antagonist in that? Anyway, I digress. That's the easy part. Like that's the easy, like that's, that's every Hallmark movie or every romance novel. But it's the harder stuff is why. Why does that matter that the boy loses the girl or gets the girl, loses the girl, get her back? Like that's what makes a story memorable. So it makes a story worth telling.
Yeah. Also
So
the
why?
genre expectations are in there too. Like
Right.
if it's a family
Well, that's the
drama, that's
how.
gonna
The genre expectation is the how.
true. Yeah, yeah.
So if it's a boy meets girl in sci-fi, it might be boy meets AI girl. That's Ex Machina. That's a story.
Hmm.
It's different than Pride and Prejudice or something. Um, I like Pride and Prejudice has just become like a big kind of its own like it carries so much weight to say it. I should stop using it so freely.
No, you
How
should
do
keep
I?
going. Like it's awesome, and I think that everyone should read it.
But I think it's come to mean. I think it comes to stand for more than it actually is. It's become like a phrase that like I think people throw it out, and it's like, uh, is it just because it's the opposite of sci-fi that I just said that? Anyway, I'm digressing. I'm
I don't
living in
know.
digression town. I start with what happens. Like
That
that's what
story
gets me
arc.
hooked. That's the hard part for me. It can be the hard part for me because it's not the first part or the second part. It's always the execution in the end of why. Okay, how do we? What's the cool way to wrap up? Boy meets girl, boy loses girl, boy gets girl back. Like that. So I start right there. Like I tend to. Wouldn't it be cool if I did a story that involved these plot elements?
Hmm. Okay.
That's what I get kind of excited about. Then what follows is usually the who would be the most interesting person for these things to happen to, right? Who would
Mm.
be an interesting person to boy meets girl? Who's an interesting boy and who's an interesting girl? What makes that?
That's
Um,
interesting. In my head, that's kind of reverse engineering it. But if that's, but that wouldn't be reverse engineering for you. That's just where you
no,
start.
no. Like I was talking about writing these witness accounts,
Hmm.
and so it always starts with like, wouldn't it be cool if? Right.
Mm.
Like one of the stories I want to write involves with a donation that gets made to a historical society that sits in a vault for years, and then there is a discovery within that vault that it has some paranormal connection, and
You
who's the
just
most interesting?
debunked my idea of why that is then.
What do you mean?
Well, I was thinking, is the reason why you start with the story, the what if, because you already have the characters? Like you write in a series, so you already know who the character is.
But not always. I don't always write in a series.
Yeah. That's why I
Um,
was like, oh, you just debunked my
but
idea.
yes, no, but I think series writing is slightly different. Like the if you're writing a romance series and like who the person that's going to lose and regain the partner. Um, the characters walk into my world pretty easily. Like I almost uninvited. Inundated with character, so I tend to just start thinking of situations and then um, you know not even joking, like a character might say, "Boy, that would be really hard for me to deal with if that happened." And then I would say, "Okay, like I'll
Let's
put
put
you
you
in
in
that.
there.
I'll put you in there." Right. So when I had this idea of this donation, like who would be the most awkward, who would be the most challenged by this donation? Well, a curious person, right? This donation comes, it sits there for 50 years. They're a volunteer their whole life, and they're deathly curious about what was in that box and why is it in the vault, right? That that character came second to that situation.
Hmm.
So that
That's cool.
her arc got layered in over the top of the whole story. And then when that character arc, or you would call it the emotional arc, the emotional arc, I think of them interchangeably, I guess.
Yeah, me too.
Um, then that changes the story arc. So like I might have this rigid idea of what that line is, like boy meets, like we're going to stay in that example, but boy meets girl, boy loses girl, like that. When that character comes in, then it alters it slightly. Like, oh, this might be a boy meets boy, boy loses boy, boy meets wins girl or something. Like I might like twist that stuff around a little bit based on what the character tells me works or doesn't work for them.
Hmm. Hmm.
There's a lot of people talking in this head, and it's really not hard for sometimes to put people into those situations. It's the execution and what happens at the end that gets probably where I get bound up the most. That's the hardest part.
I think for new writers,
Mm,
um, the character arc is probably the one they think the least about.
I
And the
agree.
reason I say that is because often when they think of a hero in a story that's usually slightly based on them,
Right?
which is totally fine, they create this like perfect individual, this perfect representation of, this hero of their own story, the most interesting, like, oh, I'd totally be friends with this person. They like all the same things, whatever. But if you make them so good at the beginning, like there's never any, it's a flat character arc. There's no improvement. There's no change. I guess it doesn't have to be an improvement, but there's no change.
It has to
And
be
they
a dynamic
become
element.
this, what?
There has to be a dynamic element
Yeah,
of
I was
some
just going
kind.
to say it's too static.
Yeah, yeah,
So, so yeah, so the character arc is usually what I first talk about when I'm teaching story structure. Because again, same, like that's the way I start. That's the first thing that comes to me is the character. So then I'm like, okay, well, if this is the character, like what's their problem then? And once I know what their character flaw is, or I don't know, people call it sometimes the mortal wound or something like that.
yeah.
So whatever that issue is that they have, this invisible baggage that they didn't know that existed, like often the character doesn't know that about themselves. So whenever I know what that is, then I know how the story arc ends and also the character arc. So if the character starts out with a character flaw, like I always use the example of not being able to trust someone, like they just feel distrustful of other people, and maybe that manifests in like never having a solid relationship, that lasts any longer than 6 months or something like that. Or
Right.
maybe it's, that they keep all these business opportunities keep passing them by because they don't trust someone else to like collaborate with. Or maybe it's just that they're overworked and burnt out because they don't ever let anybody else do anything. They're just like hovering and micromanaging everything. So somehow it's like ruining their lives. Like it has to be a big enough thing that it impacts the way that they live or don't live their life. And then, okay, so if it is that they don't trust people, at the beginning of the book, then at the end of the book, they have to trust somebody. Like that is the emotional journey that this character is now going to go on. So you already know how it's going to end. So that's great because sometimes you're like, "Oh, I got this character and I don't know what's the story? I don't know." So at least the emotional part of the story, you now have an ending to. And then the story arc also kind of mirrors it a little bit in that you have to create something for them to then trust in the
Right.
story. So
This
what is
you're
the
getting into the
thing?
intention arc.
The intention arc. This is new. This isn't a Bill Kenmore thing. What is the
It
intention
is.
arc?
It's
Is
the
it?
intentional arc, right? Like, um, okay, so I'm just gonna kind of look at his, like,
Uh-huh.
it's when the character when boy meets girl, right? In our example, does the character mean to meet girl? Is it like is it a meet cute? Do they meet the ideal girl when they are already engaged? They do not intend to meet the girl. So then, but that lack of intention, like that drives the narrative too, because they're not driving towards that goal of meeting that girl. They think they have that girl. So then maybe that shifts the intention of the story. Maybe the first 12 pages of the first two chapters of that book, they were planning their ideal wedding, or they were swept up in their fiance's planning of their wedding, but then boom, they meet the perfect girl in the new wedding planner. Now their intention changes. Now their intention is, you know, avoiding the wedding planner because oh boy, she's really got some energy that I like and I'm trying to stay away from her. So it's how you know, what that main character's what their goal is or what they're wanting as they go it through the plot and how it runs counter to say sort of maybe what their emotional drive is, right? Their emotional drive is pushing them towards that true love interest, while their intention is trying to stay with the woman they mean to marry.
So the
So there's
intentional arc seems to me as like a subset of that story arc then. It's what happens, their plot devices, their yeah,
it's
plot
sort of
points,
to me it always seems like
obstacles,
the interior what happens interior, right? Like or what the drive is interior wise.
motivational.
Motivational arc. Maybe that's
Yeah.
a better way to put it.
And
Um
I find that that part fits into, and this is all semantics, and it's just the way I'm
yes.
categorizing it in my brain.
Yep.
I see that that is part of a character arc, that that
Oh
character
yeah.
motivation. But
Right.
again, I think the story arc and the character arc, kind of mirror each other a little bit,
It is a
like,
subset. It is a
mhm,
subset, but they do run opposite of each other, right? The character's emotions may be like, I'm sad that I'm actually finding myself, I'm not gonna, I don't want to marry the woman I meant to, but I'm also trying, like, so they're doing two different things at the same time. They're being pulled in two different directions. It's kind of the act two, like, if you graft it out in a line, like
mhm,
the act two, the emotional and the intentional arc should be far apart. They should be unaligned because that's what the character's struggling to put together is like, and then in act three is when they align their intention and
mm,
their emotion
mhm,
and they drive towards the execution of plot.
mhm.
Right? Did I just wing something?
You just winged something, but it makes sense. And
I
then,
think you
oh,
go.
I was just going to kind of go off on a different arc thing. So if you
Do
want to
it.
finish up, oh,
No, you do it. You do it.
the narrative arc, then, again, I think that's just sort of like the scaffolding. I don't know, like it's just how the story's being told. Is there something else that I'm kind of missing? And
I
I'm
don't
not
think
saying
so.
that that becomes the easy thing to do because often we have to really hone in on how this all in service to the story, right? So
Of
how do we
course.
hone in and create the best story? Like maybe we've got a killer character, we've got the plot down, it's super interesting, you've got all this tension and stuff, but like how are you going to create, in what way are you going to tell the story? Is it a giant flashback? Like you start at the end and then you flash back and the whole story is getting to the ending that the reader already knows? Or is it told, in alternating POVs? Or, so you have to come up with the structure of not the story
The
structure.
telling.
Huh?
There's the story and there's the telling, right? It's like a
Yeah.
joke. You could tell five people could tell a joke, the same joke, and they it's how you structure it, right? It's how you
Hmm.
structure the setup and the punchline and all that that makes the difference. But it's the same, it's the same premise and the same payoff. Um, it's the how you tell it.
And sometimes that's really hard to come up with,
Ooh.
especially if you're writing memoir too. Like that is so hard. The narrative arc of
Amen,
memoir
sister.
is like, do I tell it this way? Should I intersperse it with this? And what about this part? Yeah, it just becomes is it linked essays? Is it memories all hodgepodge in there together with a thematic arc? We didn't even talk about the thematic arc.
Right, right. And I think that
There's
for
so many
this,
arcs and stories. Forget the three.
well, I was going to say the beauty of Bill Kenauer's, what he's put together is that he's sort of simplified it to three. But I think if you really got down on a master's level, there's a lot of arcs, and some stories will like the arc is like how the story is told. Like I love Stephen King to death, but there is absolutely no nuance to how he tells a story. Not absolutely no. There's very little nuance to how he tells a story, especially now. I mean, he hasn't gotten crazy with his, how he, like The Shining has some narrative tricks and fun to it, but he's not trying to tell an interestingly weird story in a weird way. He doesn't have to because he gets you there with premise and character, and that's his bread and butter. So there are elements in a story that don't have to be like it depends on genre. Your
Hmm.
cozy romance probably doesn't have to be so terribly wild in how the story is told, but it darn well better have character, and it darn well better have emotion. Um, so yeah, I think that to you can overthink all of this, but maybe you don't have to in all of it. You can just say like, well, this is a cozy romance. It takes place at a beach town. That's it. I don't
Yes.
know. And it's linear and it's single point of view. That can be fine.
Yeah. That could be amazing.
Yeah. If you're
It all
writing like,
depends on the, I guess, the execution and the
yeah, right. Well, so let's close on this because I'm always curious. We're talking about like, us as veteran writers or, who've at least been at it learning for a really long time. But give me like, how do you talk to people, a writer who's new at this, who's new to thinking this, Val, I've written this book, and you look at it and say, wow, this character is pretty static, or this, the emotional arc is flat, the character is not dynamic. How do you uh, bring those topics up to someone? How do you coach them to see the need of dynamic elements in their stories?
for the character arc, if the character arc is flat or the character itself is flat, I think two things are usually the issue. One is that arc is missing, like that the flaw is not apparent at the beginning. And if you have I th- the formula is this: character plus flaw plus death of flaw at the end of the book. That's the character arc. So if those parts are not in there, then the character doesn't change. They're too static. And arguably, there are some books that don't require much of a character arc because of what they are, like Ian Fleming's.
James Bond.
Yeah, just going to say that. So, or Jack Reacher, or any like long running series where you've got like one dude that's doing the same stories kind of
Or
over.
lady,
What's that?
or lady, or
Yeah.
lady.
Like detective stories, things like that.
Yeah.
So sometimes that's okay, but you want a little bit of change. They still need to be a little bit of a dynamic character just to hold interest. So that is one of the reasons why. And then the other is dialogue, inner dialogue. Inner dialogue is part of dialogue. So maybe you can have this really awesome, witty repertoire, whatever. Like these people have this great rapport and they're just firing great dialogue back and forth at each other. But if you don't have the inner dialogue of the protagonist, then the reader doesn't really know who that person is underneath. Yeah, it's all surface, it's just talking heads, but like, what are they actually thinking about underneath it? What's the emotional resonance? And that also could be a reason why a reader would be like, I just didn't connect to the character. They're just sort of flat, two-dimensional, whatever. So inner dialogue and like that character arc.
I brought that up with a client, like this idea of inner dialogue, and that like it really changed the conversation because they hadn't really thought about like, and I gave him the example. I'm here telling you what I think your book needs, and you're telling me we're having a conversation, but what are you thinking as I'm talking to you? You might be nodding and going, "Oh, great, okay," and you might be thinking, "Wow, this guy doesn't know what he's talking about."
Yeah. And you write
Right? I
that
mean,
in, you know?
yeah, like a well-rounded character is a balance of those two things, and it shows that like because we all live in that world, when
And
you watch
also that
somebody
that shows the tension too, Like so if they're
the internal thing.
thinking
Yeah,
something and something else is, yeah, you're going to see that point you were talking about in the story, like where they
yeah,
are opposite of each other, and so that can create tension and character motivation too. Like
yeah.
if your reader is like, why would she do this? If you have
Right,
inner dialogue, then you'll know why.
right, right, right.
All
This
right.
is good stuff.
It's good stuff. We could talk about this a lot, but I think we should close for there. We've talked about the story arc, the narrative arc, the emotional arc, the thematic arc, starting stories. Yeah, a little bit of troubleshooting. I think this was a good episode. It was fun.
Love it, love it.
All right. Well, bye for now. We'll see y'all next week.
See you next week.